Welcome everyone to another module. This is going to be a RNAV approach into one of the runways in Orlando International Airport. Now, with this, what I want to do is to emphasize and cover a couple things as points of emphasis. Number one is operating in VNAV for the latter part of this arrival and the approach and some of the information and nuances that are available to you using VNAV for the latter part of this descent profile and the approach itself. The other thing that I really want to make an important point of emphasis is situational awareness. That is a term that you've probably heard a number of times. Situational awareness is key as a crew member in an airliner cockpit, and that has many facets to it. And I'm going to try and demonstrate some areas where I have seen in the past that complete situational awareness is not being adhered to, and where you need to be aware of where you can improve that if it's something that will allow you to be involved as the total pilot in every aspect of the operation, especially during the latter part of these arrival and approaches. Things get quicker here. There's a number of things that will be going on in terms of communication, in terms of operation of the mode control panel, the monitoring of the approach. And so there's multiple things going on here, and I'm going to look to cover a couple of those things here because I'm going to do in segments. Here we are in this situation where I'm going to just essentially go through the setup portion, and then in a separate video, we'll go ahead and fly the approach. But I want to cover some setup aspects of this because that's pretty important when it comes to the practice of situational awareness as some of the things that are going on that are part of the setup process. One of the things that I'm going to do in this module is to change the approach. We have initially, when we started the descent and arrival, we set up, whether we were advised to do that or we took the initiative on our own for this particular arrival, to land over on the right complex in Orlando. So what we did is set up the RNAV approach to runway 18 right. And as you can see in the FMC, we have the latter part of the arrival here into Orlando, then a discontinuity because we would then be vectored to the RNAV approach for 18 right. So just to show you that that is in there, I want you to see that the rest of the waypoints are in here for 18 right. Now that was something that was set up in all likelihood prior to the descent. Here's what I want to emphasize. I am going to change the runway. Now, I want to cover a setup here and cover some situational awareness that's associated with this. Whenever you as a crew decide to load the approach for any runway at an airport, if I'm the flying pilot, and again, your airline may have specific procedures. Generally, I would think that most would probably have the non-flying pilot or the pilot monitoring load the approach and then be confirmed by the pilot flying. However, depending on your particular airline, maybe what they'll do, they would allow anybody, any crew member, whether they're flying or not, to load the approach. So that is something that's probably dictated by company procedures or latitude within a company culture. But the one thing that I want to point out is that situational awareness is very critical for both crew members in this situation of loading an approach. So what we're going to simulate here, gang, is that approach control has given us a new runway, a new approach to the Orlando airport. So what we're going to do is go in and reload the appropriate approach for what we've been assigned. And that is going to be the RNAV to 17 right rather than RNAV to 18 right, which we already have set up. Now with that, gang, what I really want to start to emphasize, I don't care if you're flying or you're not flying. The complete process to do this is step by step by one pilot. And then what is most important when it comes to situational awareness is that I, as a pilot that is not involved in loading the approach, are watching every step of it, whether I'm flying the aircraft or not. This is situational awareness. I'm not just involved in my own little world and operation. I'm looking at the total picture. I've said in some previous modules, one of the best attitudes an airline pilot can have is assume you're flying this trip all by yourself. Obviously, that's not the case. It's a crew process. But if I have a mentality to be aware of and understand everything that's going on inside the cockpit and outside the cockpit, I'm a much more complete pilot that has a situational awareness that is acute and, I believe, necessary. So in any case, whoever's going to make this change, will just do that. But let's go in here. What we're going to do is go into the approaches here. We'll go into the arrivals here in Orlando. And what we'll do is go ahead and load our nav approach to 17 right. Now, again, for those of you that are new and you're you're learning the system, as you go into any of these pages, what is the most important thing to understand, gang, is look up here in the upper right-hand corner, see how many pages there are, because you're going to have to scroll through some of these for the arrivals as well as the approaches. So we're looking for the RNAV approach to runway 17 right. And they're generally in order here with a precision approach. Then we're going to go over to the next, all the runways here that have ILSs to them. And then what we're going to do, we come into the RNAV approaches here. And the one that we're looking for is the RNAV approach to runway 17 right. Now, if I'm the pilot that's not loading this, I'm watching every step. Whether I'm flying the aircraft or whether it is on autopilot, which in most cases that's going to be the case, it's easy for me to watch what's going on here. And another thing that I've emphasized before, and I want to emphasize again, don't just look at your side of the aircraft. I don't want to be looking at the left side if I'm the flying pilot and not look over at the right and see how things are set up and what's going on over there. I can look across and do that. Get in the habit of looking at the whole picture, not just half the picture in the cockpit. So in any case, what we're going to do is select 17 right. It's got a transition, but in this case here, we are not going to use that transition point. So we'll go ahead and go to the legs page. And what I want to do is look and see if the approach in reverse highlight is shown here. And go through the pages there and see that you have the appropriate waypoints. You can check that on your chart as well and see that the appropriate runway is in there. And then the missed approach. So we'll go back to here and see this reverse highlight. Now here's what's most important. That's my foot. I'm stopped. My foot. Here's what I want you to do. This is where most airlines might have some kind of confirmation process that you have the right approach. Because you go into places like Orlando and some of the other major complexes, it's very easy to load the wrong approach. You maybe heard it differently. And don't think that doesn't happen, because it certainly does. So in any case, I want to confirm with my partner that I have the right approach in there. So the pilot who has not been involved in loading this approach should be looking over here, and chances are your airline does have some kind of confirmation process that the appropriate runway is loaded. So with that, I want to not only see that it is loaded in the FMC, however, in either one of these nav displays, do we have anything showing that the approach is waypoints are loaded? No, we don't. And here's what is important. This is something I've mentioned in some of the other modules. Anytime you're loading something into the FMC, go to one side of the cockpit and see that there is, in this case here, it's still a long way off, so they're all really condensed here because part of this is the continuation of the Lisi arrival, and another part of this is waypoints for the approach. So it's kind of hard for me to determine that, but I know something is loaded in there, and I can feel confident that not only I've seen the reverse highlight in the FMC, and I've seen it on my map, and then I can go ahead and do is execute the approach. Now, the one thing that we're doing here as we look at this, we have Lisi waypoint ahead of us, and then Orlando, and then we're going to get vectors to the approach. So I have all of that loaded, and I'm confident that I have the approach in the FMC. Now here's the other thing that I want to go over at this point. And the question I'd ask is, are we set up with the system to be fully operable in the FMC with the lateral navigation and the vertical navigation? As I look at my FMA, I should be able to tell that. And that's not the case because we have, instead of FMC speed, we have MCP speed here. And I can look up here and I can see that's what we're operating in. Also, I do not have VNAV alt or any kind of VNAV mode here, and I can see that I don't have that engaged as well. Because remember, we're talking about altitudes and speeds that are associated with the VNAV portion. Now, the other thing that I want to point out here too, this is one of the most valuable pieces of information in the aircraft. I think for when you're on arrivals and when you're on approaches. It's blinking back and forth here, but it wouldn't do that in the real world. But the thing that I want to point out with this, gang, is that this is giving me information on how I'm doing on flying a profile to meet, in this case, what is a mandatory altitude restriction page. It shows how far it's away. And here's what's most important, and I've got modules on knowing what the flight path angle, what the vertical bearing means, what the deviation means, and how to fly this profile or see how it's performing. I'll talk more about this information as we make the arrival. But right now, what's important for you to understand is that this information that is this vertical bearing that is showing up here, that 1.2, that's telling me that I have to make with a descent that has at least that angle on the aircraft. Now, right now, this flight path angle, that is, I'm flying straight and level here. I can see here that I am. So that's what the angle of the airplane is through flight. I have to at least match that vertical bearing, because a vertical bearing is the calculation by the computer to get to that waypoint, 4,000 or above, at this ground speed. Don't be confused on that. It's not the indicated airspeed, it's the ground speed. Now, we're going to talk about some other aspects of this as we start to fly the approach, but I really want to start to emphasize this. Again, that's my foot. Gang, the one thing that I want you to really get in the habit of, because it's so valuable, the flying pilot during an arrival and an approach should be almost continually up on this page. If for any reason you go out of it, come back to it and always be monitoring this information. This ought to be in the cross-check of your arrival and descent and approach profiles as much as you're watching information here and here. Just a couple other things that have to do with situational awareness too. As pilots in the cockpit, again, I've talked a number of times about making sure these two displays are different. Now, in this case here, this is a little unusual because this has such huge of distance that all these waypoints are just kind of blended in here. I should at least have checked this, and what I can do is go back to something more realistic as we continue our operation. And you should be in the habit all the time of monitoring your own nav display, the other nav display, and selecting on your nav display something that's appropriate for you. And hopefully most of the times what it's going to be until you get on the approach itself is going to be something different than what's on the opposite side. The last thing that I want to cover here, gang, is getting into the appropriate mode for the operation in VNAV. Now, VNAV is a complex thing, and this is the thing you don't really get in training that much until you get out into the real world. Now, we get into VNAV when we're doing approaches in training, but you get here above 5,000 feet, and you know what? You don't know too much about how this VNAV operates. Here's what I want you to understand. We determined that we're not in VNAV in the FMC for the descent profile and the speed profile. So what I want to do is go into it. Now I'm going to show you something here that's very important because it's really important to understand. When I go to engage VNAV and I engage the button and it doesn't engage, treat it like any other computer that you try and execute an action on. Give it a second chance. Hold the button a little bit longer. But if it doesn't engage, something is amiss. And that something amiss is that the aircraft does not understand where the descent profile is to be calculated from. So right now, this is almost a giveaway here that we don't have an altitude that this can calculate from. So what I'm going to do is just kind of release us a bit here so that we can look and see how this operates. Okay, so we're moving now. We're on the arrival here. And what I want to do is go into VNAV because I want VNAV path here or some kind of VNAV mode. So I engage it. It went into VNAV altitude, so it understands that I have an altitude that I can operate from. So what is important to understand, gang, is that in some systems, I want to pause this again, in some systems, that would not have engaged. And this is the thing about, at various airlines is that their systems may not necessarily be upgraded over time to software, older model airplanes and things like that. So here is again where there is some nuances to operating in VNAV. And the thing that I wanted to cover is if I came up here and this was in a MCP mode and I went to engage VNAV and it did not engage. Understand, it did not engage when I tried to execute it. It just would not engage and it stayed here with altitude hold. And it didn't change to FMC speed. This is an advanced system, so it did engage. But you're going to find a lot of systems out there that you're operating. I go ahead and I execute it and nothing happens. Try it again. And if it doesn't engage then, you're not going to get it to engage. And there's a reason for that, because it doesn't understand the 9,000 feet here from where to start to calculate to get down to that altitude. So what I want you to understand is if that happens, if you went to engage it a second time and it did not engage, here is where you can correct the situation. By going to the cruise page, and notice there's no altitude in here. And what you have to do is enter the altitude that you're at should level at, put it in here. See that it's reversed highlight as it is right here now, and then go ahead and execute it. That turns magenta. You can go up here and engage VNAV. And notice, even here, by doing that, what we did, instead of having VNAV out, now we've got VNAV path. The aircraft is really set up to descend to the waypoint restriction that it is calculating for Delta here. And notice what we've got, we've created with this, with what we've done, is a top of descent on the magenta line, where this is telling us to reset our altitude because we've got to set something lower in order for it to make its descent. But once we reach that top of descent point here, and we're in VNAV and we set a lower altitude, and in this case here we're going to do in the next segment, we'll set that lower altitude and the aircraft will automatically descend. But notice one thing that's happened here, and we've covered this in some of the other modules. When I went to VNAV, now the speed went up to 250 knots. We were maintaining 230 knots. So the system has calculated what the speed would normally be here at this altitude of 9,000 feet. In this case here, we'll leave it at that. We don't have a speed restriction. But if ATC had given us a speed restriction, we've covered this in other lessons on VNAV, but here's a reiteration. I'm going to go to speed intervention. It opens the window, and then I can set a speed. But notice it still stays in VNAV path. These are the kinds of things that you don't really get in training. These are the kinds of things you learn on the line, but I'm going to tell you what I've seen over my period of time for myself, having to make a specific effort as an instructor to know this information. If you're a line pilot, chances are there's a lot of these nuances you do not understand. And gang, I just want to make a big point of understand this VNAV operation and situational awareness. I may be flying with somebody that doesn't have the same understanding I do, and I ought to be able to recognize that, and in some cases maybe help and assist, and in other cases just kind of watch what's going on. So what we're going to do is end this segment with this setup. I'm going to go back to closing the window here. And so now we are completely set up to make this arrival, leave it to Beaver, and we know that we have to make an adjustment on altitude for it to descend, but this is all set to fly in VNAV path. So even with this system where VNAV engages, what I had to do to get a path is to go to that cruise page, enter it in the blanks, execute it, and then when that happened, now it's got a path to operate from. Before it did not. It did not have that path. So in any case, I hope this is really helpful. This, gang, is some of the more important things to cover. Situational awareness among both crew members is important. And here's the thing that I want to reemphasize again. If at any time you go to engage VNAV and it doesn't engage, give it a second attempt. And in some systems where it won't engage, then just simply go to that cruise page, enter the information, get a magenta altitude. Now it knows to where to calculate the path from that I'm currently at. Then I'll go up here, engage VNAV. The window will close. You come down here to your FMA in the pitch window and you got VNAV path. You're in business. All right, gang, this is it for this segment. Next one, we're going to fly this thing, okay?